Okay, it does work. All right, guys, welcome to Writing Fantastical Fantasy. We will be talking about high and epic fantasy in this panel. Before we get started, I'm going to let everyone briefly introduce themselves, and we'll start with Brandon Mull.
Okay, so I'm Brandon Mull. I write Harry Potter kind of fantasy, right? Like kind of middle grade, but thicker than normal middle grade. I write Fablehaven, and my most epic is Beyonders, and I write Five Kingdoms, and those are some of my series.
And I am Jessica Day George, and I am the author of like 13 or so books. I sort of lost count because numbers aren't my strength. That are all fantasy and almost entirely for young adults or middle grade readers.
I am Todd McCaffrey. I don't write fantasy.
Your first book was nonfiction.
Well, yeah, my first book was nonfiction, and then The Dragon Riders of Pern is actually science fiction. Although there's a lot of people who think it's fantasy, so I don't care. But I like saying it. And yeah, no, not so much fantasy. I've written some fantasy and shorter fictions. And
I'm Jo Walton. I write science fiction and fantasy. I have written in a whole bunch of different subgenres of fantasy, so I can probably address this question, though I think it's very interesting to consider why the Pern books were science fiction disguised as fantasy or fantasy disguised as science fiction. I'd be really interested to talk about that, but it's probably not this panel.
Wait for it. Yes. Okay. And I'm Charlie Holmberg. I write historical, romantic, and high fantasy. And that's it. I'm the least important person on this panel.
No, we're all important, right?
We're all children of God. Okay, so I just want to briefly explain. So a lot of people think that high fantasy and epic fantasy are the same thing, and depending on what field of thought you are in, it could be. I describe high fantasy as being otherworld fantasy, and epic fantasy being otherworld fantasy that's way thicker, and it usually has more complex plot lines and such like that. And so what I want to ask our panelists first, and just raise your hand if you want me to chuck this microphone at you. What does a story need to have to be a high or epic fantasy? If no one answers, I'm giving it to Jo so we can hear her accent.
Wow.
Discrimination. Okay, so I think that there's a circle that we could draw around things that we usually call high or epic fantasy, that we would agree that most of the things that were in that circle are what it needs, even though it might be possible to find exceptions to it. So I think that what you get is quite a lot of magic that you could describe as a magic system. You wouldn't necessarily describe it that way, but a magic that you could describe as a magic system. And a quest. And a secondary world, as you said. I don't think you could have something that we would call epic fantasy that was set in this world, even though historically there's things like Orlando Furioso. Nobody is writing those now. And saying that it is epic quest kind of fantasy that is in this world. And also, the other ingredient that I think that higher epic fantasy needs is that the whole world, or possibly the whole universe even, is at stake. You get books that are what I call kingdom level fantasy, where the whole kingdom is at stake, like David Gemmell's Legend. The kingdom is at stake in David Gemmell's Legend, but it's not going to end the actual world. Whereas in Lord of the Rings or the Fiona Bar books and that kind of thing, the whole universe is going to end if the quest is not fulfilled. But by this definition, you have things that it's difficult to categorize, like, for instance, Patrick Rothfuss, where we don't know, as of the end of the second book in that series, what is at stake, whether it's the whole universe or whether it is just one person's soul, which is quite unusual and weird. But I think nevertheless, if we sort of draw a circle and we say that those are the things that are in the circle, we can all think of a lot of books that fit in that category and talk about it. If other people have got better definitions, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask you a question. So would you put Game of Thrones in epic fantasy or high fantasy?
Right. It's totally epic because there are those ice zombies up there and they're coming. And I think that the thing that makes... I've only read the books, I haven't seen the series, so if it's different, please don't tell me. But one of the things that makes Song of Ice and Fire really powerful and excellent is that it is as if it was Lord of the Rings, but Gondor was having the Wars of the Roses. So you're constantly aware that there is this giant threat of winter is coming, while everybody is squabbling about all of these other things, and it gives it a high relief of that. So I would totally say that it was epic, but it is also carving out the space of the grimdark fantasy that we've been seeing a lot of recently.
Thank you. Sorry, I just had to cram that question in.
You are good. Okay, so something I want all of our panelists to ask, we'll start with Brandon, is when you begin a new book, where do you start? World, character, plot, somewhere else, and how do you build up your epic or high fantasy?
Sure. Okay. Well, of my stuff, the thing that's closest to this definition of epic fantasy would be my Beyonders series, and it's still a portal fantasy where we cross into this world. But once we get there, it's developed as if it's a high fantasy world, and there's a pretty big quest. And in fact, I describe it as it starts like Narnia and it finishes like Lord of the Rings, because which makes it kind of weird and unlike a lot of things, but it's fairly accurate if you've read the series. Where do I start? I start in lots of different places. I don't always start the same way. I know my destination is characters and relationships and trouble and decisions and consequences in a very interesting world. You know what I mean? But like with my Fable Haven series, my first thought was a place. I said, what if there were secret wildlife parks for magical creatures? And I started building the rest of it on top of that. In my book Candy Shop War, the first thing I had was a title. I wanted a story where there was some sort of trouble with a magical candy shop, and I had that title, and I was like, I'm gonna make a story out of that title, because Candy Shop War sounds like a lot of fun. My Beyonders series, I didn't even have a title, but Beyonders came about with me trying to think. Well, here's the thing: we do portal fantasies, and we cross into another world, and Narnia was a big reason I became a writer. But we tend to find our mythology there when we cross into another world. And so with Beyonders, I started out with going, how can I build a world where we cross to another world and it's not like our mythology? Like it's something that we haven't seen before. Like every creature that we encounter isn't quite like something that we've imagined yet, right? Like so I try to make races we haven't seen, and they don't come from Dungeons and Dragons, they don't come from other books, and they don't come from myths and legends. They're just stuff that's new. And that took a lot of thinking, because there's a reason we use the stuff that already exists, because it's there and it's convenient. So for me, that was where it started, and that led me into inventing races that I hadn't seen before, and I built a world around them. There's a few answers.
First of all, I'd just like to say that as much as I do in fact love Santa Claus, I really hate that Santa Claus is in the Narnia books, by the way, because they crossed over into another world and Santa Claus shows up, which raises a lot of questions about both Santa Claus and Narnia that were never approached in however many books there are in that series, and I was so bothered by that as a child, and I'm still bothered to this day. Anyway. Generally with my books, I start with one of two things. I either start with a setting, like I'll get an idea for a really different world or a different look at the story. Like, what if they did this? What if my upcoming book is basically a world that started on the premise of what if horses were forbidden by your religion and that was your family's job, was to raise horses, and so you're like a pariah now because of horses, because who doesn't love horses? If you don't love horses, put your hand down, I don't care. And then I found the character to go with that story, the characters to go with that story. But first I was thinking this world, what would it be like, what would it look like? And I usually start with that or with the character, or I will suddenly think of like, here's this soldier returning from war, and so he has this skill set, and which is the actual skill set that they used to teach in the army, in the German army back in the day, which was first and foremost taking care of your gun, and secondly taking care of your knitting. They could not send differently sized socks and mittens to the army, so they sent yarn and needles, and you were responsible for your own knitwear. Because knitting, by the way, is too complicated for women, and it feared they would overheat their brains if they knit. So up until the early 1800s, women were not allowed in knitters' guilds because they might, be unfit for childbirth with all the little stitches. And so I thought of this character, this soldier, and so he knows he's got these skills. He can knit, he can shoot, he can spit, he can swear in 4 languages. And I'm like, so where is he going? And then that is where Princess Midnight Ball, which is a retelling of the 12 Dancing Princesses, came from actually me wanting to find a story for this character that was a soldier who knits. My grandpa was also a soldier who knitted.
You've sat next to me on other panels, you are fine.
I just love that, yes. Nobody ever told me in the army that I had to knit my own socks. It would have been an entirely different experience.
My grandpa was a POW in World War II, and they wanted to keep him busy not digging out, so they gave them yarn.
This is good. I love it. It's a great tip. Okay, what was the question again? It's like, whoa.
Where do you start your stories? What do you start with?
Yeah. It depends. I'm sorry, I don't have one easy answer. I come back to a story that I developed because I was doing you could write a story on a flight up to a new convention, or half of the story, and then you write another half, and you don't have to worry about this story ever being seen by anybody. But I thought, what would it be like? How can I make a story where being meek is actually key to the story? And that was my starting point for one. And it turns out that you really have to be meek if you're dealing with a shape-changing dragon who happens to have decided to become your paramour, and she has a little bit of a temper, and it will be your fault if she burns you to a crisp, honestly. So I had it was just a marvelous thing. So the whole world just sort of came out of that one notion. And a lot of times they do. And of course, the other nice thing, see, the thing we're talking about here we also missed, you don't have to build the whole world. Big secret, you do not have to build the whole world at once. You can leave little pieces. This is why most of the maps have here be dragons on the corners. So you need to, and really in reality, and this is a writer trap that people fall into. It's like, I don't have my world completely flushed out. I haven't worked out the exfoliation system for the green narn trees yet. I know the red narn trees, but not the green narn trees. So I'm going to spend another 5 years not writing my magnum opus because I don't understand everything.
Do you know someone like that?
Yeah.
I have 2 friends that are basically writing the entire, set of scriptures for their world before they write the story. It's been years.
They'll never write the story.
They will never be.
They will never write the story, partly because this is their best avoidance technique in the universe, and partly because if they've got this world completely described, there's no stories to tell. You tell stories in the holes between understanding. You don't tell stories when you know everything. My great big secret for the universe, you don't have to know everything. You have to know enough to start the story. Give yourself a good place to start. You may actually want to know enough to continue the story, or you may just say, okay, and they rode west on their slee stacks. And you sit there and you spend a page describing, come on, we can all do this. I mean, one of the fun panels I do with people sometimes is I get the audience to give us a people, place, and a people, place, and thing, and we build a story from it. Anyway, long story. Actually, it was a very short story. But no, you can build your world from where you love to be. The rules are, though, try to make it, understand a little bit about this world, because it's going to be very hard to have a thriving community at 90,000 feet where nobody can breathe anyway, and it's a permanent ice storm. If you're going to have that happen, you got to find a heat source. Or you're going to end up building a world that has some similarities to ours. When you break the rules, remember what rules you're breaking and why. Are you perhaps starting your story in a city that is slowly dying because its economic supports don't work? Some of the things to ask. Start your whole story off. So I would say start where you want. I love starting with characters. Or wild ideas, you know. What if all telepaths were pink? Who knows?
Yeah, I kind of agree with everything that Todd just said. I start in different places. I have started different stories in different places. Sometimes I've done world building very fast. It just all comes together in my head from where I'm starting with. Other times I've fiddled with worlds and used them for different things and then, you know, fleshed them out. And so there's no sort of one way of doing it for me that works. Even in successful novels, it's worked in completely different ways with the world building. I often start with characters because characters imply worlds, like the soldier example. That if you've got somebody, they've grown up in a certain way in a certain place, they've got certain skills. You've got to sort of have the whole world go so that they can be like that. And you can develop the world from that. My first novel started from a poem which I wrote to demonstrate what it's like to be the middle link in a feudal system. Not the one who's on the bottom, not the one who's on the top, the one who is responsible to other people and has people responsible to them. Except that the poem that I wrote, it was her. It was woman. And I had to then figure out the entire world background of a world where a woman had feudal obligations and how we got to that. And I had to make up so much stuff to make this work, all of which is invisible in the flipping book. You can't see it. But to get the character that I wanted, I had to do a ton of world building so that she would be the person with the obligation. There have always been women who fought, but it's nearly always been because they want to, and if they want to stay home, they don't have to. And the poem was a woman taking up the obligation again. She used to fight when she was young and she enjoyed it, and now she's old or middle-aged, and she has to go back and do it again because, you know, everything's got a pot. And I had to do an awful lot of world figuring out to get a world for her to be real in, because there wasn't a time in history when she could be. And other times, once the world building for Tooth and Claw I did in about 2 seconds. It was like less than a minute. I had that whole world in my head, and there it was, all absolutely solid and just like that. I didn't have to think about anything. It all just pop, pop, pop came together. So it varies a lot, and what I start with. Sometimes it'll be an idea, but very often, if I have some great idea, it never coalesces into actually being a proper world and proper stories. It's just an idea, even if it's several ideas. I totally agree with what Todd said about stories happening in the holes, stories happening in cracks, and there are questions that you can ask to take your starting situation or your character or your fun idea further and make it happen. One of them is, who hates this? If we're living at 90,000 feet with a heat source, who hates that? Yeah, lots of people. But if you're living on a rock where everybody flies on and off with dragons, who hates that? Young people who don't have their own dragon yet. That's where the story is. If you follow those kinds of questions into the cracks, you can find the stories. And that's what I advise to people who I also know who've spent years building their worlds in great detail, that I advise them to follow the story through the cracks and ask those kinds of questions. Doesn't work, they never actually write it. Could be that what they want to do is write a role-playing source book. That has worked for people in the past.
Can I call the mic just for another second? Okay, good. So I'm gonna steal from Orson and be a speaker for the dead, as it were. tell you how Mom started Dragonflight, because I remember very specifically. It was about 1967, and I was in the front room in our house, and she threw me out because she needed to think. And I was quite surprised at that. She had quite nice small caves somewhere in the house, I was sure. But anyway, I said, you need to think. She says, yes, I need to think. And what do you think about dragons? I said, dragons? Why dragons? She said, well, they've had bad press, and I want to fix that. So there you go. That's a great way to start.
All right, so I'm going to crack down on you guys. We are more than halfway done, and I have asked 2 questions. So you guys each get 1 minute to answer this. Okay?
We're writing epic fantasy.
I know.
Yeah, no. And does this often work for you?
This
trick?
is the problem.
Because it's not going to work. It's a good try, though.
We've held our answers to just 1 volume.
Yeah.
Okay. So, attempting to keep it to 1 minute each. Answer the question, are monarchies getting old, or are they simply a best-loved form of government? And then suggest to everyone a different form of government they could write about that we don't see often.
Oh, that can't be an answer.
Wow, yikes. Here, skip me, I need to think.
I would have said yes until like a year and a half ago. I would have said, oh yeah, there's other form. But now a monarchy looks so good right now. I'm just gonna sit out there like, what other form of government? Monarchy all the way.
One minute. Hang on, let me start my timer. So 1 minute. You want to go back, if you're building a world, you want to go back to your economic system. That will dictate what sort of form you have. And so that means that you're going to see a lot of feudalistic tendencies, because that's what we think of when we think high fantasy. We think of kings and emperors and all this other stuff. But at the end of the day, why can't we have, a nice little anarchist cooperative going on? Everybody, and to be honest, in those days, there was a lot of cooperation going on when you were an agriculture society. Barn raising was one of the marvelous parts about the society. So why can't you do that? Why can't everybody just get together? Now, admittedly, what will happen is somebody with a kingdom and an army will come along and steal everything you ever had, but it'll be a nice start to the story.
Okay, I want to give you 2 real-world examples of awesome things that are not monarchies that are in the kind of period that you imagine that epic fantasy takes place in. So the Celts had monarchy, but they had a thing called gavelkind, which meant that when a king died, the best person who is the grandchild of a king gets elected. So everybody votes, but the only people who are eligible to be voted on are people who are children or grandchildren of previous monarchs. This eliminates most of the problems with monarchy, which is that, the eldest son is a jerk and they get elected, but they get appointed, they inherit. But gavelkind is actually really neat, and I wish that the Commonwealth monarchy would adopt this, because it would be really cool. It gives people a voice, and it gets rid of your worst people. It also means if you have that in a book, you've got people wanting to get elected, which is always an interesting plot situation. The other one is that in medieval Florence, the Roman Empire had come to an end, nobody was ruling them, they had some nobility, they were kind of feudal. The nobility kept doing this Romeo and Juliet thing and having feuds and fighting in the streets and killing each other, so the top merchant class, the guilds, killed or exiled all the nobility, said they couldn't have power anymore, and then the merchant guilds ran the city by the interesting method of putting all the qualified men who were guildsmen, putting all of their names into a purse, drawing 8 names out. Those people ruled the city for 2 months, and then they drew another 8 names out. And this worked very well until the Medici family started fixing which names went in. But it worked like that for longer than your republic has been going. It actually worked with the 8 names for 2 months. And this is medieval and early Renaissance. So you could totally have that in fantasy, except you can't, because you'd have to stop and explain it, and it's too bizarre. It's fun, but it's really, really weird. And that's the thing. monarchy, everybody understands how it works, and everybody understands this whole system. And also, because we're taking fantasy from fairy tales, it's family blown up. It's family writ large. When you've got the king and the queen, it is family, and we're talking about a family in that way, and everybody understands it, and that's why we do it. It's not that it's getting old. It's not that we all want to live in monarchies. It is that we're actually telling stories that have other levels. Sure, that was more than a minute.
I wasn't going to tell anybody.
And I thought of one, because I was trying to think, man, have I only done monarchies? And I have done monarchies a lot, and I think, I don't know, to me they still kind of work pretty cool. But I did one system in 5 Kingdoms where it was, one of the kingdoms was run by champions. And so you could be a champion, and you kind of like, the champion was in charge, and then he would appoint, aldermen or people to kind of run things. But the champion was the guy in charge because he had killed the champion before him. And a champion could amass a bunch of cities, or a champion could be content with his or her city. But you would win cities through combat, and that's a little different.
So it's like Catan.
Okay, so this is open to anyone. This is my hardest question. Are you ready? Is there a way to do high or epic fantasy that is not intrinsically historical? So we see a lot of our high and epic fantasies. They're a lot like medieval is a really popular thing, or we borrow from existing cultures, but they're all from the past. So is there a way to write these stories that is not intrinsically historical?
Yeah, sure, yeah. Well, I mean, I can steal into 5 Kingdoms. So 5 Kingdoms is another portal fantasy where we go into another world, and there's 5 different kingdoms, and each kingdom functions very differently. And one of the kingdoms there was, they used magic to develop advanced technology. And so it was magic-powered computers, magic-powered robots. It wore some of the clothes of sci-fi, but it was, the heart of it was fantasy. The heart of it was magic. And that, it certainly didn't feel medieval. And so that's one way I've done it.
It has been done, and done well. I grew up with, remember Piers Anthony? The Incarnations of Immortality was a modern world that they had developed magic instead of science. So people had flying carpets for the whole family instead of, SUVs and things like that. And I thought it was quite fun. And there's also Megan Whalen Turner's Thief of Atolia series, which is, they have guns, and it's based on Greece, but it's more modern Greece than you're thinking when you usually hear about Greece. And so they have the city-states and things like that, but they have weaponry, they are traveling faster than usual, and then also sometimes the gods come down and talk to them and things, and so that's a good one too. I'm doing a little bit in my next book. The Rose Legacy actually started out just with the horses, and you have to like horses now. But it's actually based on World War I, because that's the last time cavalry was used, because it's the first time tanks were used in battle. So this girl can drive a motor car, and now they're, she's all into she loves cars, and they have phones and things like that, but then she's also having to learn old school skills like how to ride a horse.
I was thinking maybe Roger Zelazny's Nine Princes of Amber would be a good example of that.
That weirded me out reading that, because it looks like medieval fantasy, and then he's like, oh.
Yeah, he's all over the place.
70s.
He walks through the shadows and all this other cool stuff. So he mixes a whole bunch of it together, and I think he did a good job. Wait a minute, didn't Paul Anderson do, I can remember the cover, A Midsummer Night's Tempest?
Yes.
Yes, so he had an alternate history where you had, what was it, Prince Rupert and steam engines and things like that. I mean, it was kind of altogether weird.
There was the Civil War.
Yeah, was it?
The English Civil War.
The English Civil War, not ours. Which is so much more boring. Well, actually,
I couldn't say that.
You not the Civil War, the War of Independence, though, which we call the Revolution, and everybody else calls the War of Independence, but this is here.
So what I was going to say was, you can, and there are examples, but they don't feel like epic fantasy. They don't scratch our itch that epic fantasy scratches, which I always sum up as Sparrowhawk in The Wizard of Earthsea goes into an inn and he says, "Innkeeper, I am on a quest." If you have a book where your character can go into an inn and say, "Innkeeper, I am on a quest," it's epic fantasy. That's my other And when you've got these, when you're talking about the Incarnations of Immortality, or Nine Princes in Amber, or David Zindel's Neverness, which is actually a future with spaceships, but it kind of is doing epic fantasy stuff. They don't feel like that, and they don't scratch that itch. So you can do it, but it doesn't have the feel, even if it's got the other quest kind of stuff.
That's why we all looked blank when she asked that question.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll have one more before we do questions from the audience. But besides Brandon Sanderson, what is a book that you've read recently that has amazing world building in it? And why do you like it?
But then he took over that.
Yeah, excuse me, I gotta think. I haven't been reading lately.
That's a crime, Preston. If you are not familiar with Laini Taylor's books, go immediately after this panel and before the signing and find Laini Taylor's books. She just won a Prince Honor Award for her latest book, which was the one I was going to especially highlight. And of course, my brain. Oh, Strange the Dreamer. Her book, Strange the Dreamer, is the first book in a new series. They are for teens. They're very much upper teens, all of her books, and you have never seen world building like this. Her previous series, Daughter of Smoke and Bone, was based on the premise of what if a god fell in love with a demon. And it's also about teenage girls' angst and stuff, and there's people flying and horned people being resurrected on the battlefield with magic lanterns, and you've never seen anything like it. And Strange the Dreamer is so cool, and Laini does amazing, bizarre, poetical things. She has an art degree, and it's like reading a painting, and she's fabulous.
I'm all over the map when it comes to reading, and my go-to books right now are the Sean McGuire October Days series. And you're not so much world building as urban fantasying, so it's a different world. And also Patricia Briggs's Moon Called, her Mercedes Thompson series. So those are the two where I'm at right now.
Okay, do you just want fantasy, or is SF as well?
Whatever you want to tell us.
Okay. So for awesome world building, I think I've got 4 that are recent and really, really great on world building. Carrie Moran's Weave a Circle Round looks like that book where weird people move in next door, that children's book that we've all read, and then it becomes really meta and strange, and it's got very interesting metaphysics, and I really, really enjoyed that. That came out at the end of last year. Sophia Samatar, who's Stranger in Alondria, won the World Fantasy Award a couple of years ago, and there's a sequel called Winged Histories. Wonderful, wonderful world building based on sort of Syrian mythology, which is her background, but she's just amazing. Everything that I've read of hers has been very, very poetical and very differently imagined, and really pretty amazing. Then within SF, Ada Palmer's Terra Ignota books, which start with Two Like the Lightning, they are arguably fantasy because there is fantastical stuff going on, but they're set in 2454 with some really incredible world building. And the first 3 are out. And then sadly not out because I got sent it to Blurb. Science fiction novel called A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martin. It is a first novel. If you like C.J. Cherry, if you like books where people scheme, it's full of that. And also really, really interesting, again, world building. And that's 3, 4, all of those are first novels by women that I've read relatively recently and that have blown me away. And part of the reason for this is when people email me and ask if I want to blurb stuff, I'm more likely to say yes if it's a first novel, I'm more likely to say yes if it's a woman. But this is also how I got Patrick Rothfuss, so that was also great.
All right, so we're going to take questions from the audience now. I do have a policy for one question, one answer, so we can try to get to as many people who have questions as we can. Y'all over your curls? Yes.
Does there need to be magic in fantasy, in a fantasy book? Does there have to be a magic system?
Does there have to be a magic system in fantasy? Who wants it?
I would say yes.
I would have said no.
I would say no.
Fight!
Explain your no. Yeah, give it.
A magic system, specifically, not really. You mentioned the Fiona Bard tapestry.
Yeah.
Guy Gabriel Kay, who's absolutely one of my top authors, I love him so much. He writes what's called people call it historical fantasy, where he's basing his story around a certain time period, and the only elements of magic might be, a god actually speaking to someone, or someone having a vision or something, but there's no actual magic system, there's no real magic, but the books are just beautifully written, and it's a very different world.
You do you.
I agree with that too, so Joe's wrong.
Historical fantasy doesn't have to have magic, epic fantasy does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's arguing epic fantasy needs magic.
Okay, next question. I know you got them, or I'm gonna ask them myself. I'm taking singing lessons, can you tell? Right here, glasses.
How do you write if you have a world idea, did any of you start with world ideas and then fill in a story? Because, how do you write a story out of just a world?
You look for the cracks. You have your perfectly running world. Okay, throw a crack in.
Throw a problem into it. This is one of the reasons why I argue you don't want to build your world too much, because part of the fun is throwing the problem into the world that you built and seeing how the world solves it for you. You develop something, look, over there's a magical spring we didn't know about. I don't know, maybe your city's running out of water, something like that. So that would be what I'd say. I think we're out. Okay.
Are we out of time?
I don't know.
No, we have
You got a
couple
couple
minutes.
Yeah.
Also, I would tell you to read Orson Scott Card's How to Write Science Fiction and Fantasy. He answers that question pretty much the whole novel. Okay, next.
We got Captain America.
Which one do you want some more? All right, strikes.
So you mentioned earlier that different future setting or whatever different settings don't scratch the same itches as epic fantasy. What itch are we trying to scratch?
I think it is. It's an itch that has to do with good and evil. It's an itch that has to do with having very clearly defined evil, and you can go about it. It's an itch that has to do with quests. And really, when I answer this question, I'm sort of answering it for myself. What is it that I personally want in epic fantasy? And I think that's what it is. I don't know, maybe other people want different things.
Yeah, would Lord of the Rings be a different novel if we knew that Sauron had problems with his mom and he was really
There's a lot more gray areas. I think the more modern you go, bad guys seem more bad back when they're just trying to take all the land or bring darkness over the world. Like a modern guy, I want to bring darkness over the world. It's like, so what kind of darkness? Like technological darkness?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah. And you also run into a problem of comparing them to actual modern bad guys. So you cannot actually, Sauron is not as bad as Hitler. Yeah, there's nothing in Middle-earth that's like the Holocaust. And once you start having that thing, it's not fun anymore. If it's looking like modern evil, it isn't fun to read about it in that kind of way. And there are a lot of Dark Lords that are a lot less evil than a lot of people who are alive now. But we don't look at it in those terms. And we want it to be clear. We want something clearly marked bad guy. It doesn't have problems with its mom. Yeah, totally.
All right, and Captain America.
So with the whole having different types of government systems, how would you put together surrounding kingdoms that do have different government systems and different levels of technological advancement versus magic use?
do you need those other kingdoms?
Yes.
Then just
Then write
make
those
that.
other kingdoms.
How do you do it? You do it.
There you go. That's one
Great definitive
That's
answers.
up to you to decide. And how does it affect
Your story. If the country next to them has more advanced technology and less magic, is that your story? Is that the story? Is that what's happening? Then you need to describe as much as you need to describe to tell that part of your story.
Yeah, and also you need to know what you need to know. So if you're asking the question because you've got a problem, you need to know something you don't know. One of the things that I would ask in that situation is what are the diplomatic relationships between these kingdoms? Have they had wars in the past? Have they had lots of wars? Have one conquered another one? What are the borders situation like? Why haven't they conquered all of them right now? How come this one is sitting here without either magic or technology and in between the one with magic and technology? Are they a buffer zone? What's it like growing up there? Those kinds of questions are productive of story and character that can lead you to other stuff.
I've got my wedding to plan, my wife to murder, and Kilder to flame for.
If you haven't got your hair, haven't got your